everyone. Welcome to the Arts to Mom podcast. I'm Lauren Rose, and today we're talking about removing barriers for people with disabilities in the workplace. Our guest today is Elaine Butler, who has done just that. She started a business to do that. It's called Accessible Crates. So Sydney, tell us a little bit about your chronic pain and about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Elaine Butler, and so I studied human resources at school. And while I was going into school, I also was working in a recreational setting, helping adults with disabilities and teenagers and kids, and about my chronic pain. So I have fibromyalgia. I've had that since 2018. I also have complex PTSD. And I remember at first, I didn't understand that they were correlated, but they are correlated and they are related. I was just like, what's happening? There's two things that are both very annoying to deal with. But I realized it was because of due to the physical trauma I endured in my youth, especially in my teenage years. And so then I had chronic leg pain. And I remember it started my right leg. And I was like, what is happening? It was like, so it was like, and I was like, I'm so young. Why is this happening to me? And my parents were like, oh, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah. And then went to doctors and they said, you're fine. Just get a little bit more exercise. I'm like, I'm doing all I can. And then it actually spread to my left leg as well. And now, as of now, it's in both legs and it switches, or it just happens to be in both legs. And sometimes I do need to use a cane and as my mobility aid. And I remember when I was in school, I would use it, and people, like, because some days I would need it, some days I didn't. And people would be like, you used the cane yesterday, but you don't need it today, or vice versa. And they didn't understand.
Yeah, with chronic pain, every day is different. Some days I can do certain things and some days I can't. I've got fibromyalgia as well as rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, degenerative disc disease, spinal pain, all sorts of stuff. Yeah, and every day is different. So what kind of barriers to the disabled were you finding at work?
Yeah, so there's so many barriers. Like I said in my career, I used to work with people with disabilities and support them in a recreational setting. And then I had to help them with personal care sometimes. And so for me personally, when I first started, I was okay. I started in 2015. And so I was experiencing some pain, but not as much pain yet. And so I could, do the changes and do the lifts and do it accordingly. But as my time was fading out in 2020, like February of 2020, before the pandemic started, I, started to need more accommodation, and, and people thought I was just being lazy. And it was like, no, I need this support. It's like, well, you could do it before, but not now. And I was just like, well, things change. My pain levels change. And I was like, before I was just dealing with it, too, because I didn't understand that I could get accommodation, even though I was like learning about accommodation in school. I was so scared of what that looked like. And I thought people were going to call me lazy if I got accommodation, and people were calling me lazy when I did ask for the accommodation. So my suspicions were right. And then I also had another friend who worked with me in that same program, and she uses a wheelchair. She uses a power chair. And so they were talking bad about her. They're like, oh, she shouldn't work here. Even though we're supporting adults with disabilities that use wheelchairs, it'd be nice for them to see that representation, that they can work if they wanted to. And then even our supervisor, she made her have a participant that also uses a wheelchair, and that's not safe for anybody. That was like the last straw. It's like, give her, like, you don't need to do that. And so like literally her and her, because we have tables, and so they just switched participants, like, okay, that's for everyone's safety. And there were just so many different things. And I think it breaks down to attitudinal barriers, people's perception of people with disabilities and what they can and cannot do. And when, people like, oh, well, and then that's group people like, oh, people that use wheelchairs are in the same group. But then again, there's ambulatory wheelchair users that don't always use their wheelchair. There's people that, and it's a spectrum, and a lot of people don't realize that.
Absolutely. I remember when I first started feeling the severe spinal pain, I was wearing a back brace every single day. I was coming in late. I was working from home as much as I possibly could. I was leaving early because I was just in so much pain. And even to get up, like, I planned every time I got up, I had to plan, okay, if I'm getting up, I'm going to do multiple things while I'm up because it hurts so badly to walk. And I called a lady who worked in HR that I was kind of friendly with, and she told me about reasonable accommodations, which I'd never heard of before. And So I had my doctor kind of, write up some possible accommodations, and one of them was work from home.
Mm-hmm.
And my manager said, you can't work from home anymore. You need to be in the office like all the time, even though I could do 95% of my job
Mm-hmm.
from anywhere, right?
Yeah.
But I found that my manager was really discriminatory towards me. I actually wrote like a 4-page letter of documentation of all the times
Mm-hmm.
that he was discriminating against me because of my chronic pain and disability.
Mm-hmm.
But because he told me I couldn't work from home, I refused to ask HR for that accommodation. And
Mm-hmm.
eventually I just had to stop working because I just couldn't do it. um so what made you decide to use your voice and change these things?
Yeah. So first, before we get into that, I'm gonna talk about the reasonable
Yeah.
accommodation. A lot of times, like even HR has difficulty with understanding reasonable accommodation sometimes,
Right.
I think accommodation, when people think accommodation, they think expensive.
Mm.
But it isn't, that's not the case, like reasonable. Most accommodations don't cost anything,
Hmm.
just working from home, modifying the schedule, just simple little things to make the person be able to do their job effectively. And so within that, what made me want to change things is like what I mentioned above about my friend and my situation, as well as when I
Yeah.
was at school, I was studying business administration, human resources, and I was in my employment class, and we were talking and doing a case study on accommodation. And a lot of people in my class were disgusted that they had to accommodate people with disabilities. And these are
What?
like last year HR students about to go into the field. Some are already working in the field of HR. And they're like, wait, people with disabilities actually into the workforce? I think there's such a perception around disability and what it looks like. And it's shifting now, thank God. But understanding that a lot of people have such a negative perception when it comes to disability because of the
Hmm.
societal norms and things. And so and I was like, what do you mean that they don't know that they have to accommodate people with disabilities? They're disgusted they have to do that, or they don't even know that they're actually into the workforce. And so that kind of actually lit a fire under me, because I was like, I know if like my classmates who are learning and be willing to learn are such resistant to change, and
Hmm.
what is like the workplace. And I've already heard some stories in my own experiences in the workplace just reinforce the fact that a lot of things are not right in the workplace when it comes to accommodation and understanding what people with disabilities can do and can't do in the workplace. And so I decided to use my voice to do so.
That's awesome. So let's talk about accommodations just for a minute. So
Mm-hmm.
the Americans with Disabilities Act actually requires employees, generally employers that have 15 or more people,
Mm-hmm.
to provide reasonable accommodations. So
Mm-hmm.
um, for people with disabilities. So a person with a disability is defined as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. If the disability is obvious, the employer can ask for medical documentation, which is what was in my case because I wasn't using a cane or a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And examples include like changing job tasks, reserved
Mm-hmm.
parking, accessibility to a work area, products. Like I worked with a man who had severe vision impairment, and
Mm-hmm.
the employer provided a program for him that zoomed in everything on his computer so he was able to do his job. So those are things that are, as long as it's considered reasonable, which of course is a subjective term.
Mm-hmm.
But talking to HR and your manager are the first steps. Get a
Mm-hmm.
conversation going to let them understand what
Mm-hmm.
difficulties you're having and why you're having them. Um, so after you started using your voice, what kinds of changes happened?
Yeah, and so before, what you were saying about like talking to your manager, talking to HR is the first step. A lot of times people are scared to take that step. Like
Hmm.
this, because again that again those barriers that exist. It's like, am I going to be judged for it? Even though it's in the law, the ADA, to provide reasonable
Yeah.
accommodation. But I think with that too, because the language is so vague sometimes,
Hmm.
it's like it's like they have to provide accommodation, but in the reasonable accommodations, again, what is reasonable? What does that look
Right.
like? And I
Right.
think it boils down to that it looks different for everyone. And so it's like they're like, oh, we can do this for this person, and then they like having uniformity and uniformity to understanding that, oh, we want accommodation for everyone that makes it the same, and they have the same disability or have same similar issues. And it's like, no, everyone's unique and has their own unique experiences. You
Hmm.
should be accommodating for that. And so what kind of changes happened when I started to speak, using my voice to speak up? I started creating more accessible recruitment processes. A lot of the barriers for people with disabilities is in the recruitment process. A lot of people with disabilities don't understand that they can be accommodated during the interview process and the hiring process. What does it actually look like? How can we make things more accessible for them? Again, breaking down those attitude barriers, breaking down the perception that people have for people with disabilities. Still, a lot of people, when they think of disabilities, they think of someone that uses a wheelchair, or there are lots of times like they're just in a wheelchair, never changing the language to use a wheelchair because you don't know when they need to use it, and breaking down what that actually looks like. Removing those organizational barriers, so like policies, procedures, having things in place. Like I remember I was working with an organization, they're like, okay, we need to work on our accessibility policy for our customers and our clients, and it's like, well, what are you doing for your employees? Oh, no, they don't need to be accommodated, or like we don't have to be accessible for them. But we want to make our product and our service more accessible. It's like you can't have it both ways. And that's an issue I see time and time again. A lot of companies are, okay, we know we have a client base or a customer base of people with disabilities. And they're sort of like, okay, we're going to make it more accessible for them. But it's like, okay, that's great. That's wonderful. But and then there's a disconnect when it comes to what are they doing in-house for their own employees. It's like, oh, you didn't give someone more time. You didn't explain things how they need you to explain it. You didn't give clear instructions, all these different things, which in turn will actually help increase your accessibility to your clients and your customers, because you have, employees that have this sort of experience and they feel that it's positive towards them, and they'll be like, yes, this is an accessible company. But there seems to be that disconnect for some reason, which baffles me, but it is a thing.
That's wild.
And then educating HR and the company as a whole. So, having training for the accessible recruitment process, or just having a conversation about disability awareness and what does it look like? What is invisible disabilities? What does that look like in the workplace? How you can better support as a coworker, what's overstepping the boundaries, but is just enough to support the individual, make them feel like they are supported in that workplace.
So you talked to HR and I assume possibly your manager. Was there anybody else involved in this?
Yeah, so my HR manager, the HR assistants, talking to other managers, just like the general managers of the teams, because a lot of times, like you said, the managers, like your HR was like, okay, yeah, we have accommodation in place, but your manager was like, nope, you can't work from home.
Yeah.
If you come back, and there seems to be that a lot, I think it boils down to a lot of managers in general don't really know how to manage people, or like they only have, and so they have to take more of a position and take more of a lead. And so there's that disconnect again. They don't have the proper training. HR has like sensitive training and HR and confidentiality and human rights training, but the managers, they don't really have that training. And so I think it boils down to that.
Okay. So did you get any pushback when you were trying to make changes? I would imagine that you did, but.
Yeah, so in the summer of 2021, I was working at a company and they wanted me to do the work, but about accessibility and, all these policy works, making the recruitment process more accessible. And I was like, well, you have to continue it after I'm gone, because I was only an 8-week contract. It's a summer program. And they're like, no, can you just do it all for us? And we just like recycle what you've done for us. I'm just like, I wanted them to be involved in the process, because once I'm gone, since I'm only there for such a short time, for them to continue this work and they're like, no, just write our policies and we just like, we're modify the language and we change it for the year accordingly when you're gone. And I was like, no, you have to be able to know, yes, I'm going to focus on this because this is what I love to do. But I want you to understand the reasoning behind it and understand how you can do it moving forward. And also the recruitment process, like we was using Zoom, and I was like, we have to make it more accessible, have the closed captioning enabled, know who's going to need that. People think, oh, just for people that are hard of hearing or have these things, but it's like people that have processing issues, understanding they might need to see the text, but have to have the transcription open as they're talking to someone, and having all these things in place. And so the HR assistant, she was excited to do it, but then when it actually came to actually doing the work, she was kind of nervous, because she had been there since she basically graduated from her program in HR, and so she didn't really want to rock the boat too much. And I
Right.
was like, what was like, things need to change. Like your recruitment process is okay. Like, because when I interviewed, I was like, this things could be so much better in this interview process. And I got the job. And I was like, okay, now I'm gonna help you make make it more accessible, because I had so many barriers to navigating the recruitment process. And and so she was very hesitant, and she was like, I don't know, because she's like, it's like, but this is how we've been doing things. And I think that's a lot of times that what happens is that a lot of companies, a lot of people are stuck in the traditional way of doing things, or doing things a certain way. And then, but even if it's not accessible and inclusive, even though there's such a shift for that now, they're like, oh, but we haven't done that before. We're kind of nervous, and so understanding that there's always going to be that pushback, though, and you have to understand. I give them the why. It's like, well, it's going to make your recruitment process better. You're going to find more candidates. You're going to get more diverse talent pool. I'm not taking away anything. I'm adding,
Oh yeah.
And I think a lot of people think when you add something, first when you say they think take away, even if you're simply saying you're adding things, they think, oh, you're taking away from, you're taking away what I know. And it's just like, it's like we're just adding things. If you can see, most things are staying the same, just adding closed captions, adding an accommodation statement to the job description, all these different things.
Yeah, I love how you presented it to them that, you're going to get, more recruits, you're going to have a more diverse team, and you're not taking anything away from them. I just love that mindset and the way you presented that. So how have these changes helped you or others in the workplace? Have you seen the benefit?
Yeah, so I think it allows for, like, again, a more inclusive culture for all people, because breaking down those barriers, more understanding and acceptance in the workplace. And it's like, oh, like, oh yeah, we pride ourselves on being accessible and inclusive, and an understanding and accepting employer, but then they weren't actually doing these things. And so it helps really understand, okay, how can we better our workplace? How can we continue to be more accessible, be more inclusive? Is, and we reflect on their goals and their values as a company. It's like, are we actually presenting our values? And I think a lot of times now, companies, and people that are applying for these companies are like, do they actually follow their values? And I've seen that a lot of people are quitting their jobs for a lot of different reasons, but when including, like, they see values on a company's page, says, oh, they value all these things that matches with my values, I'm going to apply, and then they don't actually live with those values.
Right.
And so, but when you start being inclusive, being accessible, it's like you start doing those values more.
No, that's a great point too, when it comes to convincing a company to actually make accommodations that, are your values just some words on a page or on a screen, or are you actually living them? That's a great point. So what advice do you have for someone with a disability who feels like there's a barrier to their work environment?
Yeah, I would say speak up for what you need. I know that's easier said than done.
Yeah.
But also understanding that a lot of times people feel like they have to disclose if they have a disability or what their disability is. But I say speak up for what you need. And by that, I mean just asking for the support you need from either your manager, from HR, or from your coworker. You don't have to disclose, hey, I'm autistic, I need this support. Hey, I need you to help me with this because X, Y, and Z. Just be like, I need your help with this, can you, or, so just being upfront with what you need and what support you need. And because, people want to help you at the end of the day, they just, they just don't know how to support you. And you don't have to disclose, it's like if there's a medical accommodation that you need and things like that, that's obviously, that's different. But it's like and again, a lot of times right now, a lot of people being diagnosed with being neurodivergent or having a disability or all these different things. And that, or like they might be suspecting that they have these things because, because it's becoming more known. And so understanding that you don't have to have all the answers, just be like, I need this support to be able to do the best I can in my job. And I just need a little bit more support from your end at this time.
Right. And I imagine that going to your manager or to HR, with a willingness and a desire to be better at your job, and, with kindness and not in a demanding sort of way, unless it gets to that point. If they're refusing to follow the law or something like that, then you can, get more, more assertive, I suppose. But I would hope that most companies would would want to help you do your job better.
Yeah, exactly, Lauren. Understanding that it's like people want you to succeed, people want the companies to succeed, and understand that success looks different for everyone, and they need to succeed, and the resources they need to be successful, it looks very different. And that could also look very different day to day, because like with chronic pain, it looks different day to day. And so understanding that it's like, oh, I need this accommodation today. And having that conversation, like you kind of mentioned at the beginning, having that conversation, having the open conversation and then ongoing conversation, being willing to be like, hey, today, I don't need that support today, but can we try this support today? And just having the open conversation and be willing on both sides, be willing to speak up for what you need. And then for the managers in HR, be willing to receive and understand what the person's asking, what they need.
Yeah, that's great advice. So where can we find more about you and about your business if we want to follow you or get support?
Yeah, so my website is accessiblecrates.ca. All my social media handles are Accessible Crates at Accessible Crates. And then also you can follow me on LinkedIn at Elaine Butler.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much for coming on. This has been really informative. I hope that it's been really helpful for some people out there that are struggling in the workplace.
Thank you
Thank
again
you
so
so
much.
much.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren. Bye.
Of course.